This is Milestones in Biology, number 4, tied in with chapter 11. This is on Mendel's experiments in genetics and how we learned about the dominant and recessive alleles and how the inheritance works. So Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk in something called the Augustinian order, which was devoted to teaching. But he couldn't pass his teaching exam. The book says that it was due to massive test anxiety, and so instead he was allowed to do research. He started his research in 1854 in an abbey in the Czech Republic, or what is today the Czech Republic. He was studying hybrids, which are offspring from parents of two different breeds, varieties, or species. So a species example is the mule or hinny, a cross between a horse and a donkey. Usually between two species, a hybrid is infertile, but when it's breeds, like say a golden retriever and a husky, then they're fertile, but you get an interesting change to the phenotypes. Varieties is a term most often used with plants, like varieties of roses. Now, the reason he studied peas, they had short generations, so you could get results fairly quickly. You can control the pollination. The pea flower is fairly compact, and so he could use a little paintbrush to take pollen from one and put it in another and be sure that those were the two parents included. He initially wanted to use mice, but the local bishop thought it was, quote, vulgar to experiment on animal reproduction. So his basic process was, first he controlled the pollination to get strains of peas that were completely homozygous. They would always produce the same traits in their offspring. Then he used those so-called true breeding peas to cross plants with different traits, say white flowers versus purple flowers. And then he crossed the offspring of the crosses to see what happened the next generation out, because people would have known that sometimes you can get a trait that a grandparent had but a parent didn't. So here's the results that he got. So he studied a lot of different traits that all had two forms: white or purple flowers, green or yellow peas, smooth or wrinkled peas, and so on. The first generation all had the same phenotype. We saw that with the Punnett square example, with one heterozygous dominant parent, one heterozygous recessive parent. They all ended up, or one homozygous dominant parent, one homozygous recessive parent. All the offspring were heterozygous, and so they all would have had the dominant phenotype. But then the second generation, crossing those heterozygous plants, always had a 3-to-1 ratio. 3/4 of them had the same trait that the parents had, but that last quarter had the trait from the other grandparent. So if it was white and purple flowers, the first generation all had purple flowers. Second generation, you got 3/4 with purple flowers, 1/4 with white, even though none of their parents had had the white flowers. So this shows the second generation cross. They call the first generation the F1 offspring. And now here they're the F1 parents who are going to create F2 offspring. And so here's our standard heterozygous cross. You get 1/4 recessive, 1/4 homozygous dominant, the other half heterozygous, but that gives them the dominant phenotype. So there were two major theories of inheritance at the time. One was called preformationism, The idea was that the entire future organism is found inside the egg or the sperm, and there were arguments of whether it was the egg or the sperm. More common or more popularly subscribed to in Mendel's time was the idea of blending, where parental traits will mix like paint colors. So if you had a yellow and a blue, then the offspring would be green. This illustrates each of those options. So spermist and ovist were the two varieties of preformationist. And then here's the blending idea. If this had been the case, then all of those peas that had one purple flowered parent and one white flowered parent should have had light purple flowers, but that wasn't what he found. So in the case of traits that are either or, like the white versus purple flowers, that doesn't really fit with blending. There wasn't a mixed phenotype. And then what he saw with the second generation, where the white flowers came back, having a trait from grandparents that the parents didn't have. These didn't quite fit with the blending hypothesis. And then this illustrates the full cross of purple and white, which made all purple, but then those all purple made a few whites. Now, later on, he started to examine two traits together, such as smooth versus wrinkled pea and yellow versus green pea. And in this case, the yellow and the smooth were the dominant. Wrinkled and green were recessive. And over here we have that 9:3:3:1 ratio. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 possibilities for smooth yellow peas. 1, 2, 3, 4 smooth green peas, 3 for wrinkled yellow, 1 for wrinkled green, the double recessive. So Mendel proposed two laws about inheritance based on this research. The first was called the law of segregation. This is the idea that every organism has two elements, he called them, now we call them alleles, for each trait, but only one goes in each gamete, the egg or sperm. The second is the law of independent assortment, which we already talked about, that each trait is determined individually, not tied to the other traits. So he didn't find that yellow peas were always smooth and green peas were always wrinkled. You could switch those out. So these are some of the traits he examined and the actual results he got. As you can see, they're very close to 3:1. The other thing to note is these two with the largest sample sizes were the ones that were closest to the probability ratio. The smaller the sample, the more chance that just random occurrence is going to throw it off. And that's something we may see in the lab. So that is the end of simple inheritance and mitosis.